All right, this is the fourth of the September 7th videos. Uh, we're dealing with these second, third, fourth, and fifth videos about the Paul Wilson method and its focus on focus. The tiny dog now is mine. One text, one theme, one doctrine, one image, one need, one mission. This video is about the one need and the one mission. So where theme and image were really about the structure of the sermon, the internal structure of the sermon, need and mission both speak to the issue of the existential relevance of the sermon, more about the content than about the structure. So talk about first about one need. So the easiest way to say this is that the one need is the one existential question that this sermon addresses. And it's important to say this existential question is not your existential question. It may be, and probably will be, but this is your audience's existential question. What is the need for the gospel? What questions do people have? What worries do they have? What longings? I like the word longing better than the word need. What longings do they have? Now, let me say right up front that the need and the mission, although they are about content, the one need of the sermon may not be expressed explicitly. This is really your, as you've gone into the biblical text and begun to work with the biblical text, and you begin to think about what God is doing in this text, then, at the same time you're thinking about your audience. And so you say, well, this Bible passage seems to be saying that God is leading God's people in mission. And then you think, well, why would my people need to hear that? Well, you could say, well, they need to hear it because it's God's word. True. But do they need to hear it? It's not a matter of what you need them to hear. It is when they come to sit in the pews of a church or to join you online or to sit around a campfire, what's on their heart about their discipleship, their stewardship, their vocation that this sermon might help them with. That's what we're getting at here. So for the preacher to be thinking, you all need to shape up, or you all need to be more faithful, or those are not needs in the context of this sermon method. And I'm going to put in the on the website a Dilbert cartoon that gets at this very directly. I don't know yet how to show to use this camera to show a cartoon because I've got it on as a scanned PDF. But I'll put it in the on the website and you'll be able to see it. So your identification of the one need or the one longing should be a cry that comes not from you as the leader or the preacher or but rather from the members of the congregation or from the world. I long to feel God's grace, or I long to know why I'm unable to connect with people emotionally, or I long for peace in my neighborhood or in my household, or I long for justice. When will the shooting stop, or how are people in New Orleans going to get the help they need? The longing can be personal, it can be global. We've got longings across the whole range, and the idea here is to say that our sermons, cannot address all of them unless we are being very, very broad and vague. Say God's going to make everything okay. Say, well, that addresses every need. Great, but it's a boring sermon. So to begin to develop your text, your biblical text, and to begin to see how it shapes and leans toward an existential longing is just going to increase the sense of relevance of your sermon on the part of your hearer. And this relevance can be sensed at many levels. It can be very deeply personal. or it can be global. But when people say that sermon touched me, it's possible to understand that to mean that this preacher seems to know what I long for, what I need, and she has fashioned this sermon in such a way that that longing was addressed. In the same way, if a sermon deals effectively with global needs, political needs, economic, ecological, and individuals get a sense that some of their concerns have been heard and are being addressed here, that's an indication that you have touched their longing, their need. The addressing of the need can also have a mission application, so that we're going to talk about the one mission a little later here. But on the one hand, God uses for God's mission the energy and power of people who have experienced grace. So we are trees that bear good fruit in the biblical language. And so as our needs are met, we internalize and come to understand the power of the gospel in our lives. Having our needs met can begin to have missional applications. Paul says in Corinthians about a consolation. It's in our funeral sermon, that we can console others with the consolation we ourselves have received from God. So that as we have heard the gospel address our longings, that gives us language. It gives us impetus to begin to address the longings of the world. And on the other hand, people are drawn into causes of justice and peace for reasons other than conversion. And they can be drawn more deeply into a relationship with God's grace as their questions are responded to, as their needs are responded to. That may give them confidence or a new sense of passion to be involved in God's work. So that's what the one need, the one longing is about. We'll have more to say about all these things, and we'll work with some of these categories in our classwork, which is why I want to get the lectures out of the way on video. One cautionary tale I want to say here is that I do not believe that human need sets the agenda for preaching. I believe God sets the agenda for preaching. So God's revelation of God's self is always relevant. The problem is we don't always see the relevance, of course. So I believe that God always has God's own thing to say. So I don't believe that human need drives the agenda for preaching. Although, at a funeral or at a wedding or after a disaster, in some ways the human need does drive the agenda. Insofar as you're addressing the death of a person or the griefs and the changes that are involved at a wedding, but in general, human need and longing does not drive our preaching, but is in partnership with what God seems to be revealing to us through our work with the biblical text and the composition of the sermon. So that's the one need, the one longing. Now I want to talk a little bit about the one mission. The 4-page method suggests that a sermon deals with only one mission. In traditional homiletics, the mission might have been referred to as the application of the sermon. How does this sermon translate into action in my life? What does it empower me to do? What does it instruct me to do? What does it make? What of what I might do is made clearer by this sermon? Some homiletical methods talk about behavioral goals of a sermon. That could be related to mission. It's the so what of the sermon, the imperative that follows the indicative of God's grace. There's a lot of different ways to think about this mission. But I want to say that just as the one need goes from the internal to the global, so also the one mission can be something very personal. So the one mission, the thing that this sermon might do is to encourage prayer or encourage reaching out to a neighbor or reaching out to it can be a very personal thing, but it also can be more global. Lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. The one mission is also contextual. mean, God has a mission in the world. We talked about that in our first class session. God is up to something in creation, and when it comes to completion, it will be good news for all people. But we, as individual Christians and as Christian communities, are in particular context. And so one of the important aspects of the one mission is to make it fully contextual, so that it's not be nice to people, be welcoming to people. It is more specific than that, specific to the community's context and location. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go. God is not dependent on the church to get God's mission done, but God has called us to bear witness to God's mission, and God uses us as the means by which life is brought into the world. So for us in our preaching to help believers and the church as a whole to understand its place in God's mission and what that mission looks like concretely is really key. Now, according to Paul and St. Augustine and Martin Luther, among others, because of our sinful wiring, we are inclined to miss the gift quality of the law and to misuse the mission or the law to evaluate Christians. So we misuse the law when we use it to determine how well we are doing in our Christian walk or how badly we are doing in our Christian walk. And then we get into all kinds of fretful worries about how are you doing with God and where am I with God, or how badly I'm doing with others. The intent of grace is to free us from scorekeeping and worries of that sort, and to free us for the life we were created to live, a life of agape love. So it's one of the pitfalls of preaching anyways, in any method, but Paul Wilson method included, is that the one mission can turn into a sinful, twisted version of the first use of the law to show us how lousy we are or how lousy you are. So insofar as the mission of your sermon is going to involve telling the church what to do, it belongs early in the sermon. It is not grace to tell people what to do. So if that's important in a case, and sometimes it is important, to say this is what this congregation needs to be doing and this is what we need to be doing in this time and day, fine. But that needs to go early in the sermon when we're still talking about trouble. So going back to the book, to page 20, I think it's page 24, where he talks about the definitions. The burden on us to act as Christian disciples, the commands on us to act, those are all part of the trouble. They're all part of the law. So it's a cautionary note, and again, we'll say more about this as we get to preaching. The way that a 4-page sermon is constructed, page 4 is delivering God's promise, not dumping more guilt on me. So if you're going to dump guilt, do it early in the sermon, page 2 probably, so that you can leave space for God to be acting at the end of the sermon. But there are some really important ways to approach mission that does not just sort of lay additional burdens on the church. And let me just say this, a little dirty secret about the church. Everyone in the pews already knows what they're supposed to do. They are not waiting for you to tell them that they need to be more merciful, more forgiving, more generous, more hospitable. It's not. They know that already. So if the best you've got is just to sort of pile on more guilt about how we're not all that we should be, just forget it, because we don't need any more of that. We've got plenty. The church has been guilting itself for 2,000 years to be better at being the church, and it hasn't yet figured out how to do that. So let's approach this a little differently and say that God is the actor, not us, and that when we're going to talk about mission, we're also going to talk about God's empowerment. That is, how does God empower the mission? How does God empower us to be the Christians that God intends us to be? So all of that will come into play as we talk about how mission fits into the content and the material of the sermon. So that should do for now. That's the need, the longing, and the mission of a sermon.